All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at strategy number 24 from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War.
Uh,
And this one's called Take the Line of Least Expectation, also known as the Ordinary Extraordinary Strategy, which is kind of a cool title.
yeah, very descriptive.
So, what we're going to be exploring is how appearing predictable can be the perfect setup for a move your opponent just never sees coming.
Right, exactly. It's all about using their own assumptions against them. You lull them into this sense of security.
Yeah.
They think they've got you all figured out.
Yeah, you're playing right into their expectation.
Right, and then bam, you hit them with something completely unexpected.
Okay, so to fully unpack this, the core concept here, as Greene lays it out in the book, is that victory can often come from this sort of blend, right? You appear to be following a set pattern, almost a routine, but then surprise, you deviate sharply and catch them totally off guard.
It's kind of like a feint in boxing, right? You make them think you're going one way and then you switch it up. And it works because we're wired to look for patterns.
That makes sense. Like, our brains are constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next, based on what we've seen before.
Exactly. And so when you're facing an opponent, you're looking at their past behavior, their usual tactics.
You're trying to get a read on them, basically.
Yeah, and you're preparing your defenses accordingly. You're anticipating their moves based on those patterns. And that's precisely what this strategy exploits.
You play into their predictions, you almost encourage their assumptions, and then
You pull the rug out from under them. And it's incredibly effective because they're not ready for it. They haven't built their defenses against that particular attack.
Now, Greene provides a really vivid historical example to illustrate this: the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan.
Oh, the Mongols. Yeah, they were masters of this.
And it's interesting because their application of the strategy involved, and this might sound counterintuitive, appearing weak, like deliberately.
Yeah, they were incredibly good at deception on the battlefield. One of their tactics was to actually feign weakness, even retreat.
Like they'd make it seem like they were on the run.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine you're facing the Mongol army, this force that's known for its ferocity, its speed, its sheer power, right? And suddenly they're turning tail and running.
What would your gut reaction be?
Well, naturally you'd think, hey, we're winning, let's pursue them, finish them off.
You'd see it as an opportunity to capitalize on their apparent weakness.
Right. But what the enemy wouldn't realize is that they're being drawn into a trap. As they pursue the fleeing Mongols, their formations would start to become stretched and disorganized. They'd get overconfident, thinking they had the Mongols on the ropes.
And their focus would narrow entirely on that perceived victory.
Precisely. They'd lose sight of the bigger picture, of the potential dangers lurking around them, and then, bam, the Mongols would execute this incredibly swift and coordinated counterattack.
I'm picturing like a whirlwind of horses and arrows suddenly materializing out of nowhere.
That's exactly it. Their legendary horsemanship allowed them to turn on a dime, encircle the overextended enemy, and just absolutely crush them.
So the enemy's own certainty, their conviction that they understood the situation, becomes their downfall.
Exactly. They're so sure of themselves, so focused on the retreating Mongols, that they completely miss the real threat. And that's the brilliance of this strategy. You're not just attacking their armies, you're attacking their minds. You're creating this illusion, and they buy into it completely.
Okay, so beyond just this incredible historical example, Greene also lays out some specific advantages of attacking from this line of least expectation. And the first one is, of course, the element of surprise.
Right. I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? If your opponent doesn't see it coming, they have zero time to prepare, to put up a defense.
Red flat-footed.
Exactly. It's like a magician's trick, right? They're so focused on what you want them to see that they miss the real move.
The misdirection. Okay, and the second advantage Greene highlights is that it forces your opponent to make mistakes.
Yeah, because when you're surprised, you're not thinking straight. You're panicking, you're reacting impulsively, and that leads to bad decisions.
You're not making those calm, strategic moves you would if you had time to plan.
Right. So they're more likely to expose weaknesses, overreact, misjudge the situation, and you can exploit that to your advantage.
And the third benefit, Greene argues, is that it can lead to victory with less effort.
Yes. Think about it. If your enemy is completely unprepared, Their defenses are down, their troops are scattered, their thinking is clouded.
You're basically falling apart before you even strike.
It's like hitting a house of cards, right? A little push, and the whole thing collapses.
Okay, so we've got this overarching principle, and we've seen how it played out historically with the Mongols. But Greene also, I think, really interestingly applies this to a bunch of different areas. So let's talk about how this ordinary, extraordinary strategy works in the business world. And he gives a couple of really fascinating examples. Companies like Airbnb and Uber.
Yeah, I love those examples. Because they really show how this strategy can disrupt entire industries.
And what's interesting to me is that both of these companies kind of came out of nowhere, right? They were these small startups, and they were going up against these massive entrenched industries, hotels and transportation.
Right, and at first, those big companies didn't really take them seriously.
They saw them as these little side projects almost. Airbnb, it was like, oh, it's just people renting out their spare rooms. And Uber, it was, well, it's basically just a fancy taxi app.
Yeah, nobody thought they were a real threat. They seemed so, well, ordinary. But what those big companies missed was that Airbnb and Uber were playing a completely different game.
They weren't just trying to slightly improve on the existing model. They were totally reimagining the whole thing.
Exactly. Airbnb wasn't just about renting out spare rooms. It was about creating a whole new way to travel, to experience a destination. And Uber wasn't just about getting you a cab. It was about building this massive on-demand transportation network.
And they did it so subtly, almost under the radar. By the time those established companies realized what was happening, it was already too late.
Yeah, the landscape had changed completely.
Which brings up an interesting question, right? Like, how did these big companies, with all their resources and experience, miss this? What made them so blind to this emerging threat?
It's probably a combination of factors, right? Maybe they were too focused on their own existing business models, their own successes. They couldn't imagine someone coming in and doing things so differently.
Maybe they were stuck in their ways, unable to see the potential of these new ideas.
Yeah, maybe there's some arrogance there too, like we're the big players, we know how this works.
And then bam, the world changes and they're left scrambling to catch up.
Which, of course, is exactly what happened.
Now, Greene also talks about how this ordinary, extraordinary strategy can be applied in politics. And I think this is particularly interesting because it seems like in politics, you need to be predictable. You need to have a clear platform, a consistent message.
Well, yes and no. You're right. Consistency is important in politics. Voters want to know what you stand for, what they can expect from you. But if you're too predictable, if you never deviate from your script, you become, well, boring.
And vulnerable. Because your opponents can anticipate your every move.
Exactly. So the key is to use predictability strategically. You establish this baseline of expectations, you build a reputation for consistency, and then at just the right moment, you make an unexpected move.
A move that catches everyone off guard, that shakes up the political landscape.
And because it's so unexpected, it has a huge impact. People are like, whoa, what just happened?
Yeah.
It can shift alliances, change the entire course of a debate.
And I think that's a really good lesson for anyone, not just politicians. Like, there's power in cultivating that sense of predictability, of being seen as reliable and consistent.
Right. It builds trust. It makes people feel comfortable. But then when you need to, you can break that pattern. And it's all the more effective because it's so unexpected.
And then, even on a more personal level, Greene talks about how we can use this strategy in our own lives. By developing new skills, by coming up with unexpected strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where it gets really practical. Think about someone who's always quiet, always in the background, and then suddenly they step up and deliver this incredible presentation. They take on a leadership role. They do something completely out of character.
People are going to be surprised, impressed, maybe even a little intimidated.
Exactly. It challenges their perception of that person, and it could open up all sorts of new opportunities.
It's like you're constantly exceeding expectations. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a modern business example that Greene really dives into in the book, Tesla.
Oh, Tesla. Yeah, they're a perfect example of this strategy in action.
And it all starts with how they position themselves initially.
Right. When Tesla first came on the scene, they weren't trying to be everything to everyone. They were this niche company focused on high-end electric sports cars.
Which, at the time, seemed like a pretty small market, right?
Yeah, it was a very specific target audience. And the big automakers, they were all about gas-powered cars, mass production.
So they didn't really see Tesla as a threat.
They probably thought, oh, it's a cool little project, but it's not going to impact our bottom line.
They were focused on their own game, and they didn't see the bigger picture.
But while they were busy churning out gas guzzlers, Tesla was quietly building something extraordinary. They were perfecting their electric vehicle technology, their battery technology, their software, their charging infrastructure. They were playing the long game.
And they did it all under the radar, without drawing too much attention to themselves.
Right, they weren't making a lot of noise. They weren't trying to steal the spotlight. They were just quietly, methodically building their empire.
And by the time the big automakers woke up and realized what was happening, it was too late. Tesla was already miles ahead.
They had the technology, they had the brand recognition, they had the market share. They'd become the dominant force in the electric vehicle market.
Yeah.
And it's because they played this ordinary, extraordinary strategy to perfection.
So it's not just about making the unexpected move. It's about setting the stage for that move, laying the groundwork, building up to it in a way that lulls your opponents into a false sense of security.
It's about patience, it's about strategy, it's about playing the long game.
Okay, so we've seen how this strategy works in theory. We've seen some really compelling examples, both historical and contemporary. But now let's bring it home. How can our listeners actually apply this in their own lives? What are some practical steps?
Well, the first step is to cultivate that appearance of predictability.
Yeah.
Let people think they know what you're about, what you're planning.
Create that sense of, oh, I've got them figured out.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Let them underestimate you.
And then, while they're busy underestimating you, you can focus on step 2, which is to identify your opponent's weak points.
Right. Figure out where they're vulnerable, where they're least prepared.
Where's their blind spot?
Exactly. And then step 3 is to wait for the right moment. You don't want to strike too early or they'll be ready for you.
You've got to wait until they're relaxed, until they're confident in their assessment of the situation.
Yeah. When their guard is down, when they least expect it, that's when you make your move.
Now, step 4 is a really important one, and it's all about balance. It's about combining those moments of surprise with a consistent routine.
You don't want to be unpredictable all the time.
Right, because then people start to expect the unexpected from you, and the element of surprise is lost.
Yeah, it becomes your new normal, and then they can start to anticipate your moves again. So you need to mix it up, keep them guessing.
And then step 5 is perhaps the most subtle, the most psychological, and it's about cultivating your opponent's overconfidence.
Ah, yes. This is where you play into their ego, their sense of superiority.
Make them think they're smarter than you, that they have the upper hand.
Right, let them get cocky.
And then when they're at their most confident, that's when you deliver the knockout blow.
It's a classic move, and it's incredibly effective.
Now, Greene wraps up this discussion of the ordinary, extraordinary strategy with one final modern business example, and it's a big one. Amazon.
Amazon. Yeah, they're like the poster child for this strategy.
They started out as this simple online bookstore, right? Back when the internet was still this new, uncharted territory.
And everyone thought, oh, it's just books. No big deal.
But while the rest of the world was focusing on that one little piece of the puzzle, Amazon was building something much, much bigger.
They were quietly developing their logistics network, their data analytics, their whole platform. And they were doing it methodically, step by step, expanding their offerings in a way that seemed, well, ordinary.
Like, it all made sense on the surface. They started with books, then they moved to music, then to electronics, and so on. It was a very gradual expansion.
But each step was taking them closer to their ultimate goal, which was to become this all-encompassing online marketplace.
And they did it so subtly that by the time the big retailers and the tech companies realized what was happening, it was already too late. Amazon had become this behemoth.
It's a brilliant example of how this strategy can play out over the long term. You start small, you keep a low profile, you make moves that seem logical and predictable.
You fly under the radar.
And then, bam, you unleash your true potential and you take over the world.
Okay, so to wrap this all up, strategy 24, take the line of least expectation, really underscores this key idea, which is that sometimes your greatest strength is appearing harmless, even ordinary.
Right. If you can make your opponents think they have you all figured out, you have a huge advantage.
It's all about manipulating their perceptions, playing into their assumptions.
And then, when the moment is right, you strike.
You break the pattern, you do the unexpected, and you completely disrupt their plans. So, as you go about your day, as you face your own challenges and opportunities, keep this strategy in mind. Ask yourself, where might my own line of least expectation lie? How can I blend the ordinary with the extraordinary to create my own unexpected advantage? It's something worth thinking about. And thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.